Thank you. First of all, Mazel Tov to Max and Jacob and the entire Adam, Zach, and Dwoskin families. It's such an honor to be celebrating with you today. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. There was once a rabbi who used to get his talit dry cleaned once a year before Passover. He went to the same dry cleaner every year, and the dry cleaner always charged him $25 to clean the large wool talit. One year, the dry cleaner retired and sold his business, which the rabbi continued to patronize to dry clean his suits and his shirts. Pesach time was coming, and he brought his talit to the dry cleaner to be cleaned. When he picked it up, the charge was $100. The rabbi was surprised. He asked the owner, "Why did you charge so much? The previous owner used to only charge me $25. The owner replied, "I don't know what kind of condition your shawl was in previous years, but it took me forever to remove all of those knots." I'm going to change the topic now, but don't worry, I will mention the mitzvah of talit at the end. This week's Parsha, Pikudei, describes the completion of the construction of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. In the beginning of the Parsha, we learn the amounts of copper, silver, and gold that was brought in donations to help build the Mishkan. We also learn about the wool that was donated and dyed in vibrant colors to make clothing for the Kohanim, the priests. The people had been asked to bring as much as their hearts moved them. In other words, in synagogue speak, it was a capital campaign inspired by a message of generosity. We learned last week in Parshat Vayakhel that the women brought their jewelry and the men donated animal skins and goat's hair. The women spun the goat's hair into beautiful fabrics, which they dyed in vibrant colors. The leaders brought the gemstones, spices, and oil. In other words, some donated to create the Berman Center for Jewish Education, others donated to the Brown Live Streaming Fund, still others donated to ensure the legacy of the Clover Hill Cemetery. What happens next in Vayakhel is very astonishing. The men working to construct the Mishkan said to Moshe, "The people are bringing much more than needed for the service of the work which Hashem commanded." And Moses commanded, and it was proclaimed throughout the camp, saying, "Let neither man nor woman do any more work for the holy offering." So the people were stopped from bringing, for the stuff they had was sufficient for all the work to make it, with a surplus. What? Does that verse make you pause as much as it made me pause? The capital campaign went overboard? On February 1st, the UJA Jewish Federation of New York released a study about a new synagogue finance model a number of synagogues have been trying. The New York Times ran an article on it the next day called "The Pay What You Want Experiment in Synagogues." The study from Federation and its write-up in the New York Times suggest that when synagogues asked for support based on a spirit of generosity rather than obligatory dues, that they actually raised just as much and sometimes even more. Besides the financial benefit, they almost all came out with increased membership, which isn't terribly surprising if people can join the synagogue for a small donation. The New York Times article reports that what amounts to the first systemic rethinking of synagogue financing in a century, about 30 Reform, Conservative, and Independent synagogues across the United States have eliminated mandatory dues, all but a handful of them in just the past 5 years. The move away from mandatory dues is in part an acknowledgement that many Jewish communal organizations are suffering from the effects of growing secularization, declining affection for institutions, a dispersal of Jewish philanthropy, and an end to an era in which membership in a congregation was seen as a social obligation. For those who are not familiar with the idea, the voluntary system relies on transparency. The synagogues send an annual letter to members describing the average cost per family of synagogue operations, ranging from $1,500 to $2,900, and asking them to pay what they can. Many members pay less than the sustaining amount. So the success of the system depends on the willingness of some to give more, and many synagogues recognize the more generous donors in a public manner of some kind. But the details, pros, and cons of these models is a discussion for another day. What is important to recognize, though, is that those young adults who are part of the millennial generation are going to be difficult to recruit as dues-paying members. Research has shown that not only is the millennial generation the least religious of all the generations, but they are detached from institutions and instead networked with friends, and most certainly a do-it-yourself group. I don't have to mention how the internet has changed what it means to be part of the Jewish community. Discussing the future of the American Jewish community fascinates me, and I am both encouraged and humbled through things that I read, sometimes both encouraged and humbled in the same day. Dues are not the only thing affecting synagogue membership, however. Given their reluctance to join large institutions, millennials will have to be convinced of the why of Judaism. There has to be a compelling reason to be engaged Jewishly, with or without a synagogue. The Jewish community must help our millennials create meaning in their lives. It must be relevant. This is not only true for millennials, this is true for all of us here today. Whether you are a baby boomer wondering what the point of synagogue membership is once you are an empty nester, or a member of the greatest generation sensing that the Jewish community has turned its attention to the younger cohorts and is ignoring your needs, or you are like me, a member of Generation X, working hard, raising your kids, and barely having enough time to sleep, let alone think about the future of the Jewish people, we must always focus on finding meaning, comfort, and religious depth in our Jewish communities. Everyone is going to find a different why it is important to be Jewish. I'd like to share with you a teaching about the Parsha that touched my heart, and therefore is part of my why. Turning back to the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, why did we need to build the Mishkan anyway? What was the big capital campaign for? We can't get so focused on picking out a paint color for the lobby that we forget why we were building in the first place. At the end of Parsha Pikudei this week, we learn, and the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Hashem filled the Mishkan. We learn here and in following verses that God's presence filled the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and that a cloud covered the Mishkan by day and a fire illuminated it by night. But wait a minute, isn't God's presence everywhere? For example, Midrash Rabbah points out that God spoke to Moses from a lowly thorn bush, thus teaching that no place on earth is without the divine presence. In another Midrash, the question is asked, why is God called Makom, or place? And the Midrash answers, because God is the place of the universe. The Midrash opens with a story of Jacob, who dreamt of a ladder with angels going up and down on it. When he awoke, he said, "Surely God is in this place, and I did not know it." The Midrash suggests that the word for place, which is makom in Hebrew, was not merely where God was, but is an actual name of God. So when Jacob said upon awakening, God was in this place, but I did not know it, he was also saying, God is this place, and I did not know it. Why, the rabbis asked, did Jacob call God place? They answer that this is because God is the place of the world. The rabbis then ask an interesting question. They say, we do not know whether God is the place of the world, where the world dwells, or where the world is the place where God dwells. Let me repeat that a moment, because it's a little confusing. They ask, we do not know whether God is the place where the world dwells, or whether the world is the place that God dwells. In other words, they are asking the question of pantheism versus panentheism. Pantheism suggests that creation and God are the same, that our natural world is filled with the divine presence, that God inhabits every bit of creation, but that there is no God beyond creation. Panentheism, on the other hand, is the belief that the entire world is within God, that God is both completely immersed in our world, but also goes beyond our world, that the Creator is both infused in the creation and also goes beyond the creation at the same time. In case there was any doubt in your minds about whether the rabbis were pantheists or panentheists, at least in this midrash, let me not keep you in suspense any longer. The rabbis give a very colorful metaphor. The midrash teaches, he is like a warrior riding a horse, his robes flowing over on both sides. The horse is subordinate to the rider, but the rider is not subordinate to the horse. In this metaphor, God is the warrior and God's presence is God's cloak. The horse is our world. In other words, we are within God's presence. God's spirit encompasses everything that we do, but does go beyond us as well. I find this panentheistic midrash to be very moving. We find many metaphors for God, but not quite as many metaphors for God's presence. God's presence is often referred to as Shekhinah, and is considered the feminine aspect of God. Here, the metaphor for God's presence is a garment. It is fabric. Fabric that can encompass us, comfort us, and protect us. In many ways, it reminds me of the idea of a talit. When we put the talit on, we ideally are reminded of the presence of God. This nurturing image also fits well with the idea of the Shekhinah being the feminine aspect of God. Going back to the idea of the Mishkan as a place where God's presence would rest, we are then forced to ask the question, if God's presence is everywhere, why is there a need to build a specific structure for God? One answer given by the Midrash and favored later by commentators, including Rashi, suggests that the Mishkan was a response to the sin of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. The building of the Mishkan was never part of God's original plan, but after seeing the people's weakness and failing, God commanded the building of the Mishkan, not for God, but for us. We needed it. We were not satisfied with trying to feel God's presence in some kind of vague way. We needed a place to go. We needed something more concrete. Today, we don't have the Mishkan, the tabernacle, or the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, but we do have synagogues, ritual, and mitzvot. Many of us feel God when we are alone or without any ritual, but many more of us rely on ritual to connect us to God's presence. We have difficulty feeling and believing things that we can't identify with our five senses. God recognizes this and gave us the tabernacle to create, a place we could go to and more easily sense what is truly everywhere, but not always palpable. Whether it is through lighting Shabbat candles, coming to the synagogue to pray, or putting on a talit, I promised you I would come back to the talit. My hope and prayer for all of us here today is that we can experience God as a sheltering presence, like the comfort of a talit, that we can find that same comfort and connection in our synagogue, among our friends and family, and that we can continue to make our tradition relevant for generations to come. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Yesher Koach. Thank you, Rabbi Richmond.